guys, so today I am at my local state police post and I'm going to be interviewing a sergeant here about funeral procession laws. You've all asked about funeral processions and the history of how they came to be and what is actually legal when it comes to funeral processions. So we're going to get the nitty-gritty on that and find out exactly what is legal and what is not legal. So the history of a funeral procession, or a cortege, motorcade, or procession as they're termed in different areas of the country or the world. So this all began back in the Egyptian times, where the prophet or the priest or the kind of clergy person would lead the family and the body to go towards the burial. In the Greek times, this became a little more of a ceremonial where the body was placed on a bier and rolled, and so there was more people and they went a little bit further of a distance. Then the Romans started the processions, and this is where it became more of a class thing. So if you were social status kind of determined what kind of procession you had and how much pomp and circumstance was included in it. And then in the early 200s, the Christians decided that everyone should have some type of procession, and so everybody that died would have a procession of some kind, and it didn't really matter on the social status, that just it happened for everybody. But this is also where pallbearers started coming into play, where they would have people that were designated to roll the casket or carry the casket to the place of burial. Everybody in attendance would sing, and they would walk then to the grave. You know, back in the day, the cemeteries were either in the family's home, in their backyards, on the farms, they were maybe at the local church, so you really only walked or processed a very short distance to get from the ceremony place to the actual grave. All right, and then up to the Colonial Period, and this is about the time that horse-drawn hearses began. Now the horses would have different types of plumes, which are the feathers, on top of their head, and depending on what type of feather or no feather would designate the social status. So you can see a lot when it came to funeral processions that depending on the types of things involved in them, or the pomp and circumstance, as I've said, determined who the person was in life, their socioeconomic status, and it reflected out so that everybody knew, oh, this type of a person is being buried if they saw that procession go by. In the 1930s is when vehicles, and typically would use limousines, so then you then moved into the hearses. So it's just a little about the mode of transportation. We're going to be doing a whole nother video on hearses coming up here. But so that funeral procession became a act of respect, and it became a traditional part of the funeral itself, and it became this rite of passage from the service place over to where a person was getting buried. And a lot of times you'll see where people pull over the side of the road, or I've had where you're driving still, even though it doesn't happen in a lot of areas where people even pull over, but I've had where construction workers stop working and take off their hats and hold them as you're going by. Or I've had motorcycle riders stop and take off their helmets as you're coming, because they can see you coming from a distance with your whirly light on the front. I love those moments because it shows me that our society hasn't got too caught up in ourselves still, and there's still people who stop and respect those moments that are happening and the people that are involved in those processions, and that the family sees that and sees that other people are recognizing what they're going through. And a lot of people don't do that, and they get caught up in the speed of life and in needing to get somewhere. So if you can take the time, pull over and stop for people. Every state has different laws when it comes to the funeral professionals and the laws they need to follow in order to carry out that funeral procession. Typically you'll have a lead vehicle, and it's not always the hearse. A lot of times the hearse or the vehicle carrying the body will be the second vehicle in line. So you have this lead vehicle that kind of blazes the road ahead, and that may go ahead just a little bit and stop the traffic. So if that vehicle at an intersection, as the sergeant will tell us, they will typically get into that intersection before the red light happens. Sorry, big old truck. So then the rest of the funeral procession will come through. Now every state is a little different on that. Some allow that lead vehicle to go through a red light. Some you have to have that first vehicle into a green light for everybody else to follow. Now in Michigan, we can only go through that red light if the lead vehicle has gotten in to that light when it was green or yellow. Now the lead vehicle can have 2 flags on it. In Michigan, they are orange flags, and they either have a black cross or the word funeral printed on them. Some states you'll see that they are purple flags. We do have purple lights on our lead vehicles in Michigan, or sometimes you may see orange lights or yellow lights as well that will be flashing on top of the car, and that lets you know a funeral procession is coming. Now every other vehicle in the procession will also have a flag on it, or hope to have a flag. Sometimes you have a huge procession and maybe the funeral home doesn't own as many flags as you need, so they'll maybe flag every other vehicle. And then the last vehicle in line also can have 2 flags. But no other vehicle in that line should have 2 flags except for the lead and the last car, and that is the law in Michigan. Hey guys, so we are here with Sergeant Keith Disselcone from the Michigan State Police, and we're going to talk about some of the laws that you can get tickets for and what is legal for a funeral procession. So I'm going to have him talk a little about when the procession is in motion, what the procession can actually do legally. So go ahead.
When a procession is in motion on a roadway, all the other vehicles on the roadway will have to yield the right-of-way to that procession within an intersection on any road.
Okay. So if somebody pulls into the funeral procession or gets in front of it and tries to slow them down or stop them, they can get a ticket.
Correct. If, let's say, the intersection's going straight through a roadway and they're passing either a T intersection or just a cross intersection, a vehicle pulling into that procession is guilty of a civil infraction.
Okay.
Because within that intersection, regardless of which intersection, the only vehicles that don't have to yield the right-of-way are emergency vehicles in process of an emergency.
Okay. So in the state of Michigan, the funeral procession basically has the right-of-way. They have to stop at a red light, correct?
Correct. You have to obey the traffic control devices. Now, there may be a time where your lead vehicle or the first half of the procession is through a green light, and then it changes. The vehicles that are stopped at the intersection still have to yield the right of way to that procession. But those are the intersections where it may be helpful to have law enforcement or some sort of assistance with traffic control.
So you can get a ticket. They don't always teach it in driver's education, but you can get a ticket if you pull into a funeral procession. Now how about on a 4-lane road? If the funeral procession is in 1 lane, can somebody pass in the left lane legally? Is there anything against that?
There is not anything against that I am aware of in Michigan's vehicle code.
Okay.
If it affects the right-of-way within an intersection, then it would be prohibited. However, I know out of courtesy, I think it's best to allow the procession to continue without potentially interfering with it.
Okay. So what about if the procession is coming at you? Do you legally need to pull over to the side of the road?
That's actually a really good question, and I get that question a lot. By law, no, you don't. There's no law that says opposing traffic needs to pull over. People do it out of courtesy, but I would exercise discretion on that based on the roadway conditions. If it's safe to pull over when you're not, required to. Another word of caution, if that funeral procession is opposing you in traffic and they are turning onto a roadway, once they've turned, this lane now has to yield the right of way. The opposing traffic must yield the right of way once that lead vehicle has made the turn. Now
because
that,
it's an intersection.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's when that intersection law will apply.
Okay. So if somebody decides, I'm going to just go, and they cut through and cross over, they can then get a ticket.
Correct.
So I know when I was in Minnesota, as my mom's from Minnesota, and when my grandparents died, for both of their funerals, we had hired motorcade attendants, and that's something that in bigger cities like that you encounter. Do you know of like people around here, or I mean, we don't have motorcycle patrol really around this area, but what kind of presence can you hire or get from the police to be part of a funeral procession to ensure safety?
So we have a motor unit with the state police. They're typically used in, as for traffic enforcement, but they're also used ceremonially.
Okay.
But typically it's going to be for, someone who is buried with honors and things like that. They're not
higher profile.
Correct. They're not for
funeral.
hire. That's not to say that motorcycles are prohibited from being in a processional if they're private riders. But ours are used for, like I said, someone who's buried in honors or in a funeral with honors, as well as traffic safety operations and traffic enforcement operations.
Okay. Well, and any emergency would definitely supersede the funeral going on. So,
Correct.
say a police presence was at a funeral to help lead them. If there's an emergency, they obviously have to go
Correct.
be at that emergency before helping.
I don't ride a motorcycle for the state police. I've been involved in processions, and I've been involved in other ceremonies like parades, and I've always tell whoever is organizing it, be prepared just in case.
Yeah.
If I have an emergency at that time, you might have to have a backup plan.
Right. When you're at the funeral home, you are also instructed to turn on your bright headlights or your flashers as you go in procession. And you may be given more instructions and told when to pull to what lane as you're going down a certain maybe path that the funeral home knows, hey, when you get to this corner, you're going to need to pull to the right or pull to the left, or we're going to stop here for a moment. So listen for instructions, follow instructions. Don't be one of those people that think, oh, they're going a longer route, I'm going to take the shorter route and get to the cemetery first. Because what happens in those situations is you pull into the cemetery and park, and you may congest the order of flow of traffic. So if your end goal is to get to the cemetery and everybody else is in procession to go to the cemetery, get in procession. Don't be one of those people that think you know better and can get there first, because there is an order of things for a reason so that everything flows smoothly at the end of the day. So when you're leaving the cemetery, everybody can leave in an orderly fashion rather than having to wait for one person who's facing the wrong way to get out of the cemetery. Just a tip for you on that. So that is a few tips for you for funeral processions. You now know the law in Michigan, and these laws are the same and pertain in a lot of states. But know the laws in your state. Educate yourself, whether you're a funeral professional or whether you are a everyday person. Make sure you know what you can get a ticket for doing, how you can pay respect and be part of the tradition of funeral processions. Educate yourself. Thank you guys for watching, and make sure you subscribe, like the video, post comments below if you have questions or you want to share a story about a funeral procession you've been involved in, or maybe you got a ticket and you want to warn others about what you did so they don't do it too. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.